Ted Ammon was the wealthy, wheeling-dealing prince of Wall Street. Generosa Rand was a fiery, aspiring artist who never shied away from speaking her mind. What started off as a passionate love match disintegrated into a torturous mess of resentments, paranoia, money, and eventually murder. Hello and welcome to The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, author of suspense novels about the dark side of love, and this week I'm putting a spotlight on the multimillionaire, his wife, and her lover. We've all heard the saying, opposites attract. The belief behind this theory is that the best, most successful romantic relationships happen when two people have totally different personalities, likes and dislikes, backgrounds, the whole thing. The idea is that a relationship with these opposite personalities will be interesting, exciting, and full of passion because the two people are totally different. Ted Ammon and Generosa Rand were almost comically cut from different cloths. He possessed dark hair and dark eyes and grew up on the East Coast, while blonde, blue-eyed Generosa hailed from the sunny shores of California. He was laid back and quiet. She was outspoken and intense. He said tomato, she said no, that didn't happen. No, I'm kidding. A native of East Aurora, New York, 25 miles southeast of Buffalo, Ted had what Vanity Fair described as a modest upbringing as the son of Robert, a pension coordinator, and Betty Lee, a homemaker. He attended Bucknell University, a private liberal arts college in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, as an economics major. Ted seemed to have a pretty well-rounded college experience, joining the Phi Gamma Delta frat, playing varsity on the lacrosse team, and making friends wherever he went. As Vanity Fair noted, Ted was a pretty popular guy at Bucknell. After graduation, Ted headed straight into the executive training program for Bank of America, and this was really the start of an almost legendary career in finance. Along the way, he acquired a wife, moved to England, and get this, passed the English and New York State bars without ever attending a single law school class. As in, never went to law school. Brilliant. Ted took his brilliant mind to two different law firms before setting his sights on Wall Street, which it's the 80s, so of course he did. 30-year-old Ted joined private equity firm Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, eventually becoming a partner where he negotiated leveraged buyouts, which I don't even know what that means, but it made Ted a rich guy. He was most famously known for his work on the blockbuster $31 billion with a B, R.J. Reynolds' Nabisco takeover, a deal that made Ted a multimillionaire many times over. He was even quoted throughout the New York Times best-selling book about the deal, Barbarians at the Gate, The Fall of R.J.R. Nabisco, about his role in this bananas big transaction. Friends described Ted as possessing an easygoing charm and wit, with an inclination for forgetfulness, coupled with an incisive mind that sometimes tilted towards chaos. Kind of a nutty professor type, and according to New York Magazine, this was a guy who owned one good belt and had a penchant for stained, mismatched clothes. As one former Kohlberg Kravis Roberts colleague told Vanity Fair, Ted might have 700 ideas, only 3 of which were brilliant. The magazine also noted that Ted was known to be, quote, a bit of a flake who was prone to disappearing acts. In other words, Ted was famous for running late and missing meetings and appointments all the time. That's just who he was. His seeming disregard for time aside, Ted loved wheeling and dealing. He got excited by the nit and the grit, the dance of the deals that he was making, versus actually making money from the deals that he was doing, though, as I said before, he seemed to have no trouble making plenty of money from these deals. You know, it's what they say, you do what you love and the money will come. So while easygoing was a word you would ascribe to Ted Ammon, zealous is what you might label Generosa Rand. And given her Dickensian upbringing, you kind of get it. Born in Laguna Beach, California, Generosa Rand was the result of an affair that her church secretary mother, Marie Teresa Legay, had with a blonde Italian sailor named Generoso during a separation from her husband. The New York Post called single mother Marie, quote, inattentive and troubled. Marie died of brain cancer when Generosa was 10 years old, and it was only after her passing that Generosa learned the truth about her biological father. Generosa and her older sister bounced around to different relatives, to foster care, even landing in an orphanage at one point before finally being adopted. Clearly, there was next to no stability in her life, and sadly, when she was 17, her last true anchor was obliterated when her sister was killed in a hit and run. According to Vanity Fair, Generosa told friends that her sister was, quote, her only protection against a home life she described as abusive. After graduating in 1981 from the University of California at Irvine with an art degree, Generosa decided it was time for a fresh start, and she headed east to New York City, intent on taking the art world by storm. Instead, to make ends meet, she got a job as an apartment agent in Manhattan, which is like the lowest of the low on the totem pole where New York real estate is concerned. Like apartment rental agents, they're not getting spots on Selling Sunset or $1 Million Listing New York. So while this may not have been the most prestigious of gigs, it would pay off for Generosa because it spun her smack into Ted Ammon's orbit. In 1983, Ted, now divorced from his first wife, he's in the market for a rental apartment. So he makes an appointment to see one in Manhattan. Except Ted, who remember is the forgetful nutty professor with a penchant for ditching meetings, flakes out, never shows up. Well, Generosa was not having it, and the next morning she called Ted and ripped him a new one for standing her up. So I guess this turned Ted on because, sight unseen, he asked her out on a date. When Ted did lay eyes on Generosa, he liked what he saw. Not only was she younger than him by 7 years and blonder, she had a cute figure and, as Vanity Fair reported, a spark plug of a personality. She was brimming with strong opinions. She was a spitfire, an ambitious, take-charge woman. This outspokenness, this unfiltered willingness to say whatever the hell popped into her head was probably refreshing for Ted, who was a little more on the reserved side. For Generosa, Ted was a bag of chips, and then some. He's rich, handsome, single, rich. Ted and Generosa move full steam ahead and start dating, and it's not long before they move in together. However, Ted, still likely a little gun-shy due to the collapse of his first marriage, isn't taking Generosa shopping for engagement rings at Tiffany's, and she's definitely not happy about it. She starts to push pretty hard for wedding bells and happily ever after, but Ted is just not going there, so he breaks it off. Well, this is New York, so like any good New York love story, Ted and Generosa run into each other a few months later at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The sparks start flying again, and this time around, Ted puts a ring on it. In February of 1986, they get married. The happy couple settle into life in their swanky Fifth Avenue pad, and they also purchased a townhouse near Central Park. While Ted spends his days wheeling and dealing, Generosa, no longer toiling on the bottom rung of the cutthroat world of New York real estate, devotes all of her energy towards becoming the artist she always wanted to be. Generosa's initial artistic endeavors extended toward decorating that upscale townhouse near Central Park, including outfitting it with some sculptures she was experimenting with using industrial materials. Ostensibly, she was also trying to get an exhibition of these sculptures somewhere, but according to Vanity Fair, galleries in New York City were not clamoring to display a Generosa Ammon original. While the art thing didn't seem to be going Generosa's way, the rich society wife thing definitely was. Generosa took up writing, as in horses, collecting a slew of ribbons in a variety of shows. Ted, meanwhile, he likes doing his own thing, including listening to jazz. He counted famed trumpeter Wynton Marsalis as a friend, and he is content to let Generosa manage their social calendar since time wasn't really his strong suit. She and Ted spent weekends in Tony Bedford, New York in Westchester County. Generosa threw herself into decorating and renovating their homes, hosting parties, living that Real Housewives of doing whatever she wanted lifestyle. Another project that Ted and Generosa took on was having children, even going the route of in vitro at one point, but to no avail. Finally, in 1992, they adopted 2-year-old twins from the Ukraine that they named Greg and Alexa. According to what friends told Vanity Fair, Ted was over the moon to become a father, and as a result, shifted his priorities towards spending time with his kids and making memories. There were baseball games, trips around the world on private planes, biking through Central Park, a big city version of Ted's own Norman Rockwell childhood. Meanwhile, Generosa was a little more subdued by motherhood. Her fractured, messy childhood still haunted her, and, quote, the whole prospect of children was too painful. Apparently, she had a hard time even relating to Greg and Alexa, which is kind of strange because you would think because she spent time in an orphanage, they came from an orphanage, there'd be a natural kind of link there. But as some noted to Vanity Fair, her interactions with them were, quote, stressful to watch. To accommodate their growing family, Ted and Generosa purchased a house in East Hampton at 59 Middle Lane. This 7,000 square foot home sat on over 2 acres and featured 6 bedrooms, a solarium, gym, library, and gourmet kitchen. Sounds like a real dump, doesn't it? Now, this is kind of a strange thing to say, but the house seemed to bring out the worst in Generosa as her zealous behavior went into overdrive. For starters, she had very specific ideas on the landscaping, which, okay, sure, it's her house. She wants it to look a certain way. And in fact, the daughter of the previous owners, Pam Lord, a renowned gardener, was on board with helping Generosa realize her vision of an English-style home tucked into East Hampton. Except when she heard Generosa wanted only yellow plants up front and blue in the back only, Pam Lord said, "Peace out, I'm not dealing with this." However, there was another landscaper who agreed to plant 600 tulips for her, warning Generosa beforehand that the flowers are known for changing shades, so they can look one shade in the daytime and another shade at night. She picked the shade of tulips she wanted, and the landscaper planted them, all 600. Well, the shade of tulips that she chose, turns out, just would not do. A few days later, the landscaper found her yanking these offensive, god-awful tulips out of the ground with her bare hands, in a rage because they were the wrong damn shade. I mean, how dare those tulips? She ripped up roses. She demanded that newly planted trees be gone, all because they didn't grow red berries. The landscaper also told Vanity Fair that Generosa once called up his bookkeeper at the business-friendly hour of 5 a.m., screaming that the bubbles in her pool were, quote, blowing the wrong way. I mean, these are the things I'm thinking about at 5 in the morning, aren't you? Generosa's drive to achieve this vision of an enchanted cottage in the English countryside led her to rip her contractors to shreds. She bullied. She screamed. She stiffed them on their bills. She threatened to wreck their businesses. As architect Jeff Gibbons told Vanity Fair, quote, "She basically left me crumpled up on the side of the road." Generosa's ire wasn't reserved for people who worked for her. She managed to alienate pretty much all of Ted's friends, hers as well, and was prone to irrational screaming matches, wild accusations, screeching at women not to look sideways at Ted, shrieking rage over the dumbest of slights, real or perceived. Hello, tulips. While folks like Ted, hanging out with him wasn't worth dealing with Generosa. As Vanity Fair reported for Ted, living with Generosa was akin to, quote, walking on eggshells. His whole life became about either trying to avoid confrontations with her or diffuse them. In an attempt to start fresh, the house at 59 Middle Lane was left behind for life in the actual English countryside. While Generosa and the children were nesting in jolly old England, Ted was shuttling back and forth to New York tending to his business, Big Flower Press, which was thriving. Well, this enraged Generosa, who was upset because she thought he was spending way too much time in New York instead of spending time in England with the family. And she determined that the reason why Ted was doing this was because Ted was cheating. She was convinced her husband had a bevy of girlfriends, that he had fathered a baby with an investment banker acquaintance, friends deny this, and had even reconnected with his first wife. Not true, according to her. Nevertheless, Generosa decided Ted was making a fool out of her, and in 2000, she filed for divorce. Ted and Generosa's divorce takes on whole chapters out of War of the Roses. War of the Tulips? Maybe? No. As Eddie Murphy said in Raw, Generosa wanted half, as in half, of Ted's estimated $100 million fortune, which she claimed was closer to $300 million. She blew through divorce lawyers with stunning speed, and her alimony demands alone would make you weep. As Vanity Fair reported, Generosa wanted $50,000 for a bodyguard, $50,000 for a housekeeper, $50,000 for a chef, $50,000 for a driver, $30,000 for a gardener, and $100,000 for an assistant. Now, this was on top of $60,000 she wanted for residential maintenance. And unbelievably, this didn't even include the $180,000 a month she wanted for basic living expenses. I mean, basic living expenses. Okay. There were also the houses that she wanted. She wanted the estate in England. She wanted 59 Middle Lane in East Hampton, her artist's loft, and a newly purchased townhouse. She wanted to bleed Ted dry, and even that wasn't going to be enough. Things really started to get messy, which, yes, they get even messier because that's why we're here, when she decided to renovate this townhouse that Ted had just bought. She and Ted agreed that they would use a budget of $1 million for the renovation. And this is where Daniel Pelosi enters the chat. 38-year-old Daniel Pelosi was an electrician hailing from Long Island, New York. Dark-haired, tough-talking, hot-headed Daniel had drug and alcohol problems, gambling debts, a wife, and 3 children. As New York Magazine described him, he was kind of a fixer-upper, and that, quote, he looked like a classic low-level mafioso in caricature, all in black. Black silk shirt and jacket, greased back hair, no socks, and loafers. It doesn't exactly scream catch, does it? He was able to wrangle a job as the head of the crew that was renovating Generosa's townhouse. Daniel, as it turned out, was like your contractor nightmare come to life because he decided this project was his golden goose. As Vanity Fair reported, he kept coming up with increasingly complex repairs, which of course cost money. The pipes had to go. This thing over there had to be moved. This thing over here, get rid of it. On and on and on. The whole townhouse was pretty much stripped to the studs. Generosa, though, she likes his style. His style being, let's all fleece Ted. And in due time, Generosa and the electrician were getting it on. So all during this renovation from hell, Generosa and the children needed a place to live. And she chose to live in the Stanhope Hotel, where John F. Kennedy Jr. was said to be living before his death. The stylish, sophisticated hotel offered a suite for $1,500 a night, which Generosa decided was perfect for her, and eventually for Daniel, because he moved in with her. Then there were rooms for the kids, the nanny, the staff, the work crew, topped off with elaborate dinners, $500 breakfasts, $200 tips in the bar. According to Dateline, Generosa bought Daniel new clothes, treated him and his friends, paid for vacations and casino nights, proudly paraded him around like a peacock. And remember who is footing the bill for all of this, and in case there's any confusion, it's not Generosa. And Daniel, it seemed, Generosa had found a kindred spirit of sorts, because he was just as over the top as she was. As Vanity Fair reported, in addition to her usual tantrums, she accused hotel staff of spying on her for Ted. For his part, Daniel used to brag that he knew mobsters. The two spent hours in the bar at the Stanhope, getting smashed, screaming, arguing, picking fights. Quite a pair, huh? Ted was gritting his teeth and bearing it, because above all, he wanted to try and do what was right for Greg and Alexa. He paid for Generosa and Daniel's shacking up. He put up with Daniel being around his kids, which he hated, because he wanted to keep things calm with Generosa and get through the divorce. Generosa, of course, did her part to make things as difficult as possible. She raged at hotel employees who deigned to talk to Ted during the times he would come to pick up the kids, including trying to get those employees fired. And that was even when she would let Ted pick up the kids. On numerous occasions, she would find excuses not to have the kids ready for their scheduled time with Ted. Once during a time when she was supposed to have Greg and Alexa, she left them with a doorman at one of the apartment buildings that she and Ted owned while she was going to spend the weekend in the Hamptons instead. When she wasn't abandoning the kids, she did her level best to turn them against Ted. And I mean, there were some cuckoo clock things that she did. As the Daily Mail reported, if Greg and Alexa wanted to watch TV, in exchange, they'd have to steal papers from Ted and deliver them to Generosa. If they came back from spending time with their father and said they had fun, banished to their rooms, and then she would refuse to talk to them for days. She went even further, according to Vanity Fair, telling the kids Ted was a thief, that he'd bugged the cell phones he'd given them, that those same cell phones would give them cancer, that a satellite dish on top of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which was near the Stanhope, was actually Ted using that to spy on them. 11-year-old Greg and Alexa, not knowing any different, parroted their mother's rantings to Ted, according to what his sister Sandy Williams shared with New York Magazine. Mom says you cheat at business. Mom says you have a secret girlfriend and a 2-year-old son. Mom says you spy on us with hidden cameras. Mom says you should give her all the money. You can always make more. #twisted. Despite all the turmoil, Ted and Generosa were getting close to finalizing their messy divorce. While she insisted Ted was worth $300 million, her lawyers found it was, as Ted had said, about $80 million before taxes and debts. She'd get between $20 and $25 million. She'd get the townhouse, while Ted would get to keep 59 Middle Lane, and they would sell their other properties. She and Ted would share custody of Greg and Alexa. Generosa wasn't happy about the settlement, but she'd agreed to sign it. For Ted, it was the glimmer of light at the end of a very long, very dark tunnel. In fact, things are looking up for Ted in general, as it seems as though he's starting to find new footing for himself. He has a new girlfriend. He was moving into philanthropy, giving his alma mater millions of dollars. He was named the chairman of jazz at Lincoln Center and was working on some new projects with the Municipal Art Society. He'd even rekindled those friendships demolished courtesy of Generosa, and he was determined to spend even more quality time with Greg and Alexa once the divorce was done. For Ted, the future felt full of hope and promise. October 20th, 2001. It's Saturday morning, and Ted is headed out to 59 Middle Lane in East Hampton for some alone time. The house is a respite from the drama of his divorce from Generosa, and he is thrilled that he's going to get to keep it. He was due back in the city on Monday for a meeting with his business partner, but for now, it's just him, his 3 dogs, some jazz, and a quiet, lazy weekend. He dined alone that night and then took a stroll on the beach. October 22nd, 2001. Per his usual, Ted had missed his meeting in the city that morning. While there wasn't anything unusual about that because he missed meetings all the time, this was a little different. Because for one, he hadn't made any after-school plans for Alexa and Greg, which was strange because while he was always forgetting everything else, he never forgot about the kids. His business partner, Mark Engelson, starts to worry and makes all the requisite phone calls in an attempt to track Ted down. No dice. Finally, Mark and Ted's chauffeur, Milton Macias, head out to East Hampton, arriving at the house a little after 5 p.m. Ted's silver Porsche was parked in the driveway. The alarm system was turned off, so they entered the house. Ted's 3 dogs are there, starving and jumpy. Ted's cell phone is beeping on the kitchen counter. The 2 men call out for Ted. No answer. At the top of the stairs is the master bedroom, visible from where the 2 men were standing. And it's at that moment that they see Ted. He's nude. There's blood everywhere. As the 2 men come closer, their worst fears are confirmed. Ted is dead. He was 52 years old. A stun gun was used to incapacitate and torture him. He was kicked repeatedly. He was bludgeoned to death with a blunt object 30 times. Almost immediately, rumors swirl with a swiftness and ferocity about just what had happened at 59 Middle Lane during this autumn weekend. Murders just did not happen in the Hamptons, and in fact, this was the first in 20 years. It had to be something salacious, tawdry, sordid. After all, Ted's state-of-the-art alarm system with its 9 cameras had been disarmed. Of note, Generosa had secretly installed those cameras in order to catch Ted cheating, and he had no idea that the cameras existed. And the hard drive recordings from the cameras were tossed after the murder. So the alarm system has been disarmed, which means Ted must have known the murderer, invited them in. And the dogs didn't go crazy at the sight of an intruder. There was also a metal binder clip filled with cash that was left behind. A potent rumor that caught fire were reports that a naked man was seen running down Middle Lane over the weekend, leading to hushed, certain whispers that Ted was gay, that this was some pickup gone horribly, horribly wrong. As Vanity Fair notes, 2 Mile Hollow Beach, not far from Ted's house, was a known hangout for gay trysts. So obviously Ted was hanging out in the dunes, picked up a guy, brought him home, and that was it. Now, the naked running man thing, that actually did happen, except it was on Friday morning before Ted's arrival in East Hampton on Saturday morning. Other sleazy details included Ted getting bobbited, and yes, that means exactly what you think it means. Also, Ted was being sued left, right, and sideways, so the prevailing belief among the well-heeled Hamptonites was that Ted had somehow brought this on himself. Well, here's where we apply another saying or philosophy. Occam's razor, or translated as the simplest explanation is usually the best explanation. And namely, the simplest and best explanation there is that this has Generosa and Daniel written all over it. Daniel knew the code to the alarm system, and even if he hadn't known, he's an electrician, so an alarm would likely be child's play to him. However, he did seem to have an alibi, his sister claiming she was with him at her house 40 miles away attending a wedding and a birthday party. It's a pretty lively weekend. While police continued to investigate the case, Generosa and Daniel were busy. For starters, they got married 3 months after Ted's murder, and 1 day after his own divorce became final. And they got a whopper of a wedding gift, namely Ted's fortune. All of it. Because Ted and Generosa had never finished signing the divorce papers, because Ted hadn't yet updated his will. Now, Generosa and Daniel had the literal keys to the kingdom. Although she was made co-executor of the estate along with J.P. Morgan Chase, due to the ongoing murder investigation, they didn't exactly turn her loose in the vault, though she still had access to plenty of funds. And now Generosa had the right to sell all those properties and keep the proceeds for herself, which New York Magazine reported came to about $30 million. Wow. To escape the media glare and ongoing homicide investigation, Daniel and Generosa fled to her home in England, where apparently, at least according to what he told People magazine in 2002, Daniel envisioned a future as the squire of this English manor. Did not quite work out that way. For one, Generosa got sick. She was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2002, which New York Magazine says she blamed on Ted, strangely enough, claiming that the doctor had told Ted she needed some tests and that Ted had withheld the information from her. The truth is, her doctor had implored her to have a lump checked out and she just never did it. As it turns out, her diagnosis was grim and she was given months to live. By now, Generosa and Daniel had returned to the States to deal with his various legal problems, including a DWI, and a larceny charge connected to his stealing $43,000 worth of electricity from the Long Island Power Authority. In the meantime, a grand jury had been convened in the investigation into Ted's murder, so the hammer is lowering on Generosa and Daniel in more ways than one. Generosa, knowing her literal end is coming, gets to work on getting things in order. First, she cuts her husband Daniel out of her will, though she does arrange for him to get a $2 million post-nuptial settlement. Secondly, she leaves custody of Greg and Alexa to a British nanny, Catherine Ann Main, along with $1 million and use of 59 Middle Lane, which is weird. Like, the father of your kids was brutally murdered there, and you're like, yeah, raise them there. I mean, it's bizarre. Generosa Ammon died on August 22nd, 2003. She was 47 years old. In March of 2004, nearly 2 years after Ted's murder, Daniel Pelosi was finally arrested. And that $2 million that Generosa had left him, it would go towards his defense. Isn't that crazy? Ted Ammon's money paying to defend the man accused of his murder. Daniel's trial started in October of 2004, and he testified in his own defense, which is always a bad idea when you're guilty. And he really goes for it in his testimony. In other words, he's got a lot of theories about what happened that night. For one, Generosa was in cahoots with his friend Chris Perino. They're the ones who did it. Generosa had hired a hitman. She'd offered Daniel $50,000 to do it, but he didn't want to do it, so he turned her down. Generosa beat Ted with a tennis racket. I mean, the whole thing was a complete S show. While prosecutors may not have had a murder weapon, or witnesses, or physical evidence, what they did have was Daniel Pelosi's big mouth. In addition to his laughable testimony, according to Dateline, he told everybody and anybody that he was going to bash Ted's brains in while he slept. The nanny, Catherine Ann Main, says he bragged to her that he did it. The New York Post reported that Daniel owned a stun gun and he got off on using it on members of the crew that worked on Generosa's never-ending townhouse renovation. Among the most chilling testimony came from Daniel's ex-girlfriend, Tracy Ribbenfeld. She described how Daniel told her Ted begged for mercy, that he'd used a flashlight and a lamp to beat Ted, that, quote, I bashed his brains in and he cried like a bitch and begged for his life. She said he even wanted her to tell police that the two of them were having sex in his Bronco the night Ted was murdered. What is it about Broncos, yo? Tracy Ribbenfeld further testified that Generosa was at the house that night to essentially act as a lookout. So this is the first time that anyone's actually placed her at the house. Also there that night, according to what Ribbenfeld says Daniel told her, was his friend Chris and his nephew, Jeff Lukert. She claimed Daniel told her he hated Generosa, but that he stayed with her because she was afraid she was going to pin the whole thing on him. Prosecutors say the motive for Ted's murder was a simple one, M-O-N-E-Y. They contended that Generosa wasn't the only one unhappy with her divorce settlement. Daniel had gotten used to the high life. He reveled in the perks of being married to Mrs. Generosa Ammon. $20 to $25 million was not going to keep him in the lifestyle he'd become accustomed to. So, he murdered Ted in cold blood. Jurors deliberated for a little over 23 hours, and in the end, they didn't buy any of Daniel's crackpot theories or his ridiculous performance on the stand, handing down a guilty verdict and convicting him of second-degree murder. Daniel Pelosi was sentenced to 25 years to life. He will be eligible for parole in 2031 when he's 67. Ted's sister Sandy successfully challenged Generosa's will regarding the children and was awarded custody of Greg and Alexa, she and her husband raising the twins in Alabama. Greg and Alexa, who had grown close to Daniel Pelosi throughout the entire painful ordeal, were wrecked to realize that the man they loved as their stepfather was the man who murdered their father. In an attempt to make sense of and peace with their tumultuous past, Greg and Alexa decided to tell their story in the 2012 documentary 59 Middle Lane, a nod to the home where their dad met his brutal end. As seen in the documentary, then 14-year-old Greg stood up at Daniel's sentencing and tearfully told him, quote, I was devastated that the man I trusted and loved killed my own father. It's hard to realize that the person you loved stabbed you in the back and ruined the rest of your life. You are a sick man, and I regret every single time I said I loved you. Alexa slammed Daniel for pillaging the Ammon fortune, declaring, quote, Mr. Pelosi might have had a nice time for the past couple of years spending my parents' money, but that is over now, and I hope he rots away in prison because he deserves nothing better. The documentary also traces Greg and Alexa's origin in the Ukrainian orphanage, the twins eventually learning their biological mother was a prostitute with 6 other children who eventually died in 2004. Despite the psychological abuse Generosa inflicted on them, the horror of Ted's murder, and the betrayal by Daniel, Greg and Alexa maintain they are grateful to the Ammons for rescuing them from the orphanage. As Alexa told People magazine, quote, I'm thankful for all my parents gave us. If they hadn't adopted me, I probably would have died in the orphanage. They literally gave me life. The film debuted in East Hampton and was also shown at Jazz at Lincoln Center, an homage to their father's love of the venue. The twins, who inherited 59 Middle Lane, put the home on the market in 2017. It sold for just over $8 million. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, and you can show your love for The Dark Side of Love by visiting thedarksideoflove.com for show notes and transcripts. Also, while you're there, you can find a link to my Patreon page where you can access bonus episodes and other fun stuff. Learn more about my suspense novels about the dark side of love by visiting biancasloan.com. Thanks for hanging out with me, and join me next time for another tale of love gone wrong. I'll see you on the dark side.